Yeah, as we consider the value of a critical text such as the Westminster Confession of Faith, we begin by just understanding the value of critical texts generally. Whenever we have an important, valuable, and in this case, authoritative text, we want to make sure that we're operating with the most accurate edition. Everything's predicated on accuracy. Once we make it authoritative, we want to make sure that that everyone's moving together in sync, and that there's no disagreements as to what the source is. And so we want that single source of truth, basically, as we come to understand the confession. And where do we find that? We find that in the authors. And who are the authors? Typically, books have a single author. In this case, we have scores of authors. So how do we gauge what is the intent, the authorial intent of the assembly? Well, we come back and just say it's the assembly working together and expressing its view in the final text. And one of the key elements we have for gauging the involvement of the assembly in the final text is the role of its scribes. The scribes were given particular authority, both by the assembly and by Parliament, to be the ones who are overseeing the printing of the confession, to make sure it's accurate and that it reflects exactly what the assembly intended. And so a critical text now is an opportunity to step back and make sure we've looked at all those editions, all those authoritative editions in which the scribes had a hand, in order to step back and say, what is the text that is most accurate? And we approach this a couple of different ways, but one of the reasons that we want to, again, be sure that we look at the text in its fullness is understanding there are subtleties to text. It's not just simply, are all the words correct, or are all the proof text correct? There are other things that can come into play that we have to at least pay attention to as we look at the text authoritatively. And that is simple things, spelling, capitalization, but especially grammar. We sometimes want to simply transliterate punctuation from the 17th century into the 21st century. That's not necessarily something that can be done without some careful thought. And that thought has to begin, though, with the original intent. So we want to be able to have a text that gives us each of those fine details, so that as we now take this authoritative text and try to communicate it beyond the ecclesiastical courts, how can we do that most accurately and with the fullest agreement? And that is, let's go back to the source. And a great example of this is from the assembly itself. When it began work in 1643, as it first convened, the task that they were handed was the 39 articles. Let's revise them. And so as they started the work, the very first step they took, though, was to appoint a committee to make sure they identified the most accurate texts upon which they could work. Because they knew for them to proceed beyond that point would be fruitless unless they were working with the most accurate texts.